In this video, you're going to learn everything you need to know about Western philosophy, starting from its beginning all the way to the Renaissance in just 10 minutes. But stick around till the end of the video because I'm going to reveal a secret way to better understand and remember all the information I'm about to give you. The idea of philosophy started in Greece around 600 BC with Thales. He's often regarded as the first real philosopher and the father of science. He did something revolutionary. He figured out why things happen by using science and logic instead of attributing it to gods or mythology. He's the one that started the real questioning of why is the world here and what are things made out of? He used science to do cool things like predict a solar eclipse and figure out the height of the pyramids. It's important to note that in the beginning, science and philosophy were basically the same thing and just meant looking at the world in a logical way rather than the average person who, when they didn't understand something, would simply attribute it to the gods. Next came Pythagoras, who was born in 570 BC and made great contributions to math, including Pythagorean theorem, which basically states that a right triangle's height squared plus base squared equals its hypotenuse squared, or a squared plus b squared equals c squared. Pythagoras also came up with the base 10 number system, the idea of square numbers, and was the first person to realize that the world is actually round. Next up was Heraclitus, who was born in 535 BC. He came along to say, hey, everything is constantly changing, and said that no man ever steps in the same river twice. Since everything was constantly changing, he thought the most basic element that everything was made out of was fire. He was also a proponent of libertarianism, the idea that we as humans have free will, which is actually extremely hard to prove, and philosophers still hotly debate this idea today. Parmenides came along and said, no, things don't change, but the past and the future are set, and that the idea of time and free will are just illusions in our brain. This idea led to fatalism, the idea that we have a fate and we're stuck to it, which in turn led to determinism, the idea that everything is determined by something that came before it, and that we're all basically just billiard balls moving around this world based on forces that are outside of our control. This was actually a precursor to the idea of conservation of energy. In the 4th century BC, Empedocles came out with the idea of the 4 elements, which states that everything in the universe is made out of water, earth, wind, and or fire. He also said that there's 2 forces in the universe, love and strife. Love brings things together and strife pushes them apart. He went on to say that at the beginning of time, everything in the universe was contained in a single point of love, but that strife pushed everything apart, which is remarkably similar to the modern concept of the Big Bang Theory. Next came Democritus, who was born around the 3rd century BC. He's the person that invented atomic theory, the idea that everything is made out of tiny atoms and empty void. He was also the first person to say all the lights in the galaxy are really just distant stars, and that other worlds do exist. That concludes the pre-Socratic period. Next we move into the Socratic period, which starts with Socrates, who was born in Athens, Greece around the 3rd century BC, and is such an important philosopher, 2 periods in philosophy are named after him. Socrates is famous for developing the Socratic method, which is a way of taking a problem and breaking it down into a series of questions, and the answering of these questions leads to the solution of the problem. This is actually a precursor to the scientific method, where getting a hypothesis is the first stage. Socrates was claimed to be the wisest person in all of Athens by the oracle, which is a person that's believed to be able to speak with the gods. Now, this confused Socrates because he felt like he knew nothing. So Socrates went around Athens asking everybody about life's big questions, and everybody seemed to have an answer. However, Socrates was able to show each person that their answer to life's big questions were actually incorrect, and that they knew nothing as well. So eventually, Socrates did agree with the oracle, stating that, sure, I don't know anything, but at least I'm aware of my own ignorance, unlike everyone else who thinks that they have the answers. Socrates was sentenced to death for teaching the youth to question life, and when he was found guilty, he recited one of his most famous speeches, the Apology. Socrates didn't write down anything. But lucky for us, one of his students, Plato, did write down his teachings and called them the Socratic Dialogues. The Socratic Dialogues were basically just conversations that Socrates had with other philosophers and the people of Athens. Plato is considered to be one of the most important philosophers of all time, and he's famous for his theory of forms. The theory of forms is best illustrated by the cave analogy, which states that the way we live life is similar to living inside a cave, where we can only see the shadow of objects, while the real objects are actually outside the cave. Plato states that when we see an object, we're actually only seeing the shadow of that object's most perfect form, which exists in another realm. Plato also stated that we're born knowing all the knowledge of the universe, but that we forget it, and that learning is simply just remembering what we've already forgotten. Even though Plato lived in the world's first democracy, Athens, Greece, he was not a big fan of democracy. In fact, in his work, The Republic, he stated that he thought the best way for a country to be ruled was by a group of philosopher kings. Aristotle was a student of Plato's, and he disagreed with Plato's theory of forms, stating that if these objects don't even exist in our world, they really can't be perfect examples of anything. Aristotle was also the first person to create a comprehensive system of philosophy. This system of philosophy included ethics, aesthetics, logic, politics, science, and metaphysics. Aristotle also developed syllogism, which is a kind of logical argument. Syllogism has a major premise, a minor premise, and a conclusion. An example of this is, all humans are mortal, all Greeks are humans, thus, all Greeks are mortal. Aristotle suggested the reason for anything coming into existence can be attributed to 4 factors. These 4 factors are matter, form, source, and final cause. After Aristotle came many different schools of thought on how we should live our day-to-day lives. The 4 major different schools of thought included Cynics, Skeptics, Epicureans, and Stoics. Cynics were a proponent of cynicism, which states that the best way to live is in agreement with nature and in virtue. Cynics believe that you need to live a life that's natural for humans, and to do this you need to reject normal desires for wealth, fame, power, and sex, and live a life free of possessions. Cynics were famous for living in poverty and preaching its values. One of the most famous of all these cynics was Dionysius, who lived in a big bathtub on the streets of Athens and actually begged for a living. Christianity actually adopted a lot of the ideas of cynicism. Skeptics believed in skepticism, which requires all information to be supported with a lot of evidence. In fact, they placed doubt on their own senses, saying it can't be proved. And in some ways they were right. Just because you hear something or see something doesn't mean it's really there. In fact, we can't really prove that we're not just a brain in a vat somewhere with a mad scientist making us hallucinate this entire experience. Now we move into Epicureanism and Stoicism, which are both based on a branch of philosophy called ethics. The purpose of ethics is to look at what is good and what is bad, and why it's good and why it's bad. Epicureans believed in Epicureanism, which was founded by Epicurus around 307 BC. Now, Epicurus was a hedonist, which basically means that he thought good things are good because they're pleasurable, and bad things are bad because they're painful. But Epicurus was actually a negative hedonist, which means that he thought you should remove desires, because desires are a kind of pain, thus bad. Now, Epicurus and his followers lived far away from society, surviving only on the base essentials: water, milk, bread, and rice. They also didn't believe that dying was a bad thing, because once you're dead, there's no more suffering to be had. Stoicism, which was founded by Zeno in Athens, claimed that virtue is good, vice is bad, and pleasure is a type of vice, thus it's bad. He also claimed that the root cause of all human suffering is actually unrealistic expectations. So for example, let's say you go on your morning commute and you expect not to hit any traffic, and then you do hit traffic, well, you're really pissed off and you suffer. Zeno would have claimed that it's better to assume that you are going to hit traffic, and on the off chance you don't hit traffic, you're really happy. But if you do end up hitting that traffic, you really can't be too pissed off because you kind of expected it. He also claimed that the best indication of a person's personal philosophy is found out by watching them, not by listening to what they say. If you like this video and want to learn more big topics in just 10 minutes, click to subscribe. And if you agree, disagree, or just have something to add to anything I said, put it in the comments below.